Around the world, we've seen amazing progress, with more than 1 billion people being lifted out of extreme poverty since 1990, and major gains made in health and education and other areas that contribute to human well-being. However, the global system faces considerable challenges that can undermine this progress, such as inequality, conflict, dwindling natural resources, and of course climate change. The world is changing rapidly, from mass urbanization and a constantly growing population to an ever-expanding economy and widespread consumerism. The world is a very different place than it was 100 years ago. Top this with increasing demand for energy, food, water, and the goods that these vital services produce, and we can already see why societies begin to reach the limit of the finite resources the Earth can supply to meet these demands. Here today we have Will Day to talk to us about how some of these key system pressures will play out in the economy and society, and what trends we can expect to see in the next decade or so. Will, a CISL Fellow, currently serves as a Sustainability Advisor to PricewaterhouseCoopers and has over 20 years experience working with humanitarian relief and development NGOs in various parts of the world. He also served as the Chief Executive of Care International UK and fulfilled various other roles for a number of sustainability-orientated organisations within the UK. Through this discussion, you'll be able to gain some insights into how the most pressing systems pressures and trends affect business and society today, and how they will in the future.
So we're going to see an increase in the world's population by something approaching 2 billion people, which is a lot of people. And that's for two reasons. The first is we're living longer through medicine and diet and exercise. And the other is because people are having children. In fact, the pace of population growth around the world is slowing down. So there'll come a time when that does slow down and stabilise, but we're still, at the moment, in growth mode. And that growth happens in different parts of the world. The developing world, sub-Saharan Africa, is where there is extremely fast growth, slowing down, but still rapid. What will these people need? Well, they'll need different things depending where they are. If you live in an aging economy or a society with lower birth rates, you're going to see increasing proportions of older people, and they're going to require different levels of care, either from the state or from their savings, as they live longer. They may choose to work longer. In developing countries, you will still have old people, but you're going to be seeing significant increases in the number of young people joining the job market, and they're going to need employment of some sort. They're also going to need, as we all will, somewhere to live, means of getting around. They'll need to eat and drink, and they'll need energy, and that will place a significant burden on the natural resources that provide those things. Take the food one, for example. That requires us to grow more food in the next 40 years than has been produced in the last 8,000 years. These are step changes in the level of demand. And when you look at what it takes to produce food, both in terms of water or energy, these are really big numbers. It's about 16 tons of water to produce a kilo of beef. So meat has a very heavy, a particularly heavy footprint in that case. The link between fossil fuel energy and food production is extremely close. We use it to retail and transport and package and cook. We use a lot of energy in our food production. So those things are linked very closely together. People are going to need to live somewhere. Where are they going to live? Increasingly in cities. It's expected that cities will grow, in the developing world particularly, extremely rapidly. Something like 200,000 people a day already are flooding into our cities. So we're seeing a dramatic increase in the demand for the sorts of services and jobs and infrastructure that will enable people to live happy, comfortable lives. The implications for ministries of finance, for individual savings, for energy production are enormous. So we've got a growing population of young people who are going to be joining the job market in the next 10 to 15 years, with expectations of salary and lifestyle, partly informed by the fact that we're a very connected planet these days. People can see how other people are living. So the number I used, I think is interesting, is that there'll be about 100 million young people joining the job market just in the Middle East and North Africa. So the question has to be, what sort of employment is that going to be? Is that going to be formal employment, working for employers, or is that going to be informal employment? because these young people are going to be living in cities on the whole. The growth of cities is going to be significant, particularly in the developing world, and those cities are going to require energy and buildings and roads, as well as a functioning economy to provide the sorts of jobs and services that people are going to require. So that's all a bit of a tangle. Older people are going to require looking after more, but they're also going to be working later in life. So those sorts of jobs are going to be needed at the same time. If you ask business leaders whether unemployment or underemployment is a serious issue or a worry for them, globally, it is absolutely 100%, no, it's actually about 98% of business leaders say that they are concerned or very concerned about underemployment or unemployment. If you are a young unemployed person in the Middle East and North Africa, for example, what are you going to do? Sit on your hands and say, well, too bad? Or are you going to get on a rubber boat and head towards where you think the jobs are, which could be Europe, which is exactly what they're doing? Or are you going to pull the place down because it isn't working for you? Those are the sorts of stark options, I think, that are confronting young people. It's a question of which of them they'll choose. So I think the issues may be slightly different in developed economies. In developing economies where economies are growing, you're seeing potential for creating a lot of new jobs. In established economies, we're seeing trends in the other direction, where just under half of the world's jobs could be computerized, if we chose to, in the next 20 to 50 years. So at the same time as we have people looking for work, we have jobs disappearing because they are being done more efficiently or effectively, possibly, by machines. I'm not convinced that's a healthy tension. The other issue is about whether we are in a world where jobs for life continues to be the model. When my parents were born and growing up, there was an expectation you would start for an employer and work throughout your career for that employer. You might change, but it was the exception rather than the rule. We're in the days of the gig economy these days, where people are doing individual pieces of work for a variety of employers. There's a huge growth in the informal economy, in social enterprise. I think there are interesting new models emerging. The question is, will they be sufficient to cope with the demand from that additional 2 billion people? So both climate change and the resulting rise in sea level are going to have an impact wherever you are in the world. Sea level rise is a very slow process. It's measured in millimeters per year, but it's a very lengthy process, which means that the impact of a warming climate will have impacts on sea level for hundreds or thousands of years to come. So the next few years will undoubtedly see the sea continue to rise by millimeters or possibly centimeters. And by the end of the century, it's estimated we might see up to 1 meter of sea level rise at the top end of scientific possibility. And that, of course, has a profound impact. It's estimated that at least 100 million people would need to move away from coastlines in the Far East alone. So profound impact, and we're not very good as a species at accommodating hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people on the move. We tend politically to try to keep people out rather than to welcome them in. So I think there are big implications. A lot of people live by the coast. We always have lived by the coast, so it will have a big impact. But in fact, in the short term, in the next 15 years or so, we're likely to see a much greater impact from a changing climate, which has impact on water availability, where food can be grown, on storms, extreme weather events. So we're going to see those impacts much more heavily felt than a rising sea level. Examples might include the inability to grow really important crops. Coffee in Uganda, cocoa in Ghana, tea in Kenya will be significantly affected. It's to do with temperature and it's to do with rainfall, availability of fresh water. These are important crops because they're smallholder crops. They affect huge numbers of people who will either have to find ways of growing other crops or more likely will leave the land and head towards cities. So we're going to see climate affecting everywhere in the world. Curiously, sea level rise doesn't rise the same everywhere in the world. I always thought it was a bit like a bathtub. It's not. We're going to see higher levels of sea level rise in some parts of the world, greater impacts on people's lives, but climate change is inescapable. Science is absolutely clear that the climate is changing as a consequence of us unleashing carbon and other greenhouse gases by burning fossil fuels. And the question is, can we wean ourselves off them? Technically very feasible. We can invent the technologies. We're a creative, innovative species. We've got plenty of technologies already available that could allow us to meet the energy demands of the world and relatively quickly using renewables. Politically, it's a completely different question. It's very difficult with vested interests in existing means of generating energy, with huge value locked underground in carbon reserves, be it oil, gas or coal, to change that and to leave that stuff in the ground. Countries like South Africa and China and India have huge reserves of coal underneath them, and the United States, and they have increasing demands for the energy that those reserves could provide. So politically, it's going to be very difficult to see how governments will allow a rapid move away from fossil fuels. As I say, technically, that shouldn't be the problem. I suspect it boils down to whether we, as consumers and as citizens, give permission to our politicians to allow that to happen. Are we prepared to pay the price, or are we prepared to pass that cost on to our children and our grandchildren? That's the stark choice. So I think it's really important to be optimistic about this, because it's a pretty bleak set of issues that we are confronting, and we know about it. We can't claim ignorance. So why am I optimistic? I'm optimistic because my hunch is that when people really recognise what's coming and what could be avoided, they will start to galvanise themselves. The market can work really efficiently and effectively when it can see an outcome where investment and innovation can produce a return. That's a bit cold-blooded, but we're an innovative and creative species. And I think we do want the best thing for ourselves and for our children and for those around us. And I think when the time comes, we'll recognise that there does need to be a significant change. There will be fortunes made, crudely, solving these problems. There will be fortunes lost by those who don't understand the context and don't invest wisely or stay too late. My hope is that we can do it in time, but I'm optimistic that we can do it.
As you can see, business and society has its work cut out over the next few decades. The system, pressures and trends that we have to contend with will shape business strategy and influence the habits and preferences of millions of consumers worldwide. I hope that you've gained a better picture of the most pressing global issues that you'll have to contend with in business, and that will shape entire industries within the next few years. Now, take a moment to think about your own organisation. What are the most pressing systems, pressures and trends that will impact on your operations? How will these pressures influence your industry at large? Did you understand all of the concepts in this video? If you'd like to review any of the questions, click on the corresponding button.